My name is Jessica, and I have a private tale to tell. This story might shock some folks and cause others to criticize me, but it's my truth, and I've kept it secret for far too long. It's not a wild story of misbehavior or a big disgrace. It's a story about love, loneliness, and how a simple partnership turned very sour. My spouse, Richard, and I have been wed for nearly a decade. We became acquainted shortly after university. He was ambitious, pleasant, and quickly well-liked. I fell head over heels in love, and our first days together were like a love story from the movies. After a couple of years, life wasn't so wonderful. Richard's profession kept him away frequently. His job was demanding, and he journeyed all the time. I understood his work was significant, but the distance damaged our marriage. We grew apart, hardly talking, and when we did, it was just chat. But I felt isolated. I craved notice, companionship, and someone to fill the void Richard created. That's when things changed. We resided on a peaceful ranch, outside of town. We appreciated the open area and keeping livestock, hens, goats, and our horse, Midnight. Midnight was a handsome black male horse, so kind he appeared to grasp emotions better than most people. I always adored horses, and Midnight was exceptional. Richard gifted him to me for our anniversary, a method of demonstrating he cared even though he was away. During the solitary days when Richard was absent, Midnight became my horse. Midnight was a great source of solace for me. I'd spend many hours in the barn, grooming him, chatting with him, and simply enjoying his company. I understand it might sound unusual, but animals seem to have a knack for knowing when you're upset. Midnight always appeared to sense my sadness or annoyance, and he would gently nudge me with his nose, as if to reassure me that I wasn't alone. Gradually, these times with Midnight became the best parts of my days. I confided in him, sharing secrets I couldn't even tell my husband. Midnight was always patient, never critical, and consistently present. He filled a void of emotional support I hadn't realized was missing. I know you might be thinking, how can she compare a horse to her husband? But you need to understand that Richard was frequently away, and Midnight was my only companion. A crucial moment occurred one summer evening. Richard was out of town, as he often was, and I was feeling particularly low. I had just finished a phone call with him, and yet again, it felt like we were living completely separate lives. I went to the stable, seeking comfort from Midnight. As I groomed him, I began talking to him as usual, but this time felt different. I was unloading my frustrations, my loneliness, and the emotional distance between Richard and me. I was rambling, not really paying attention to my words, when it suddenly hit me that I was talking about Midnight in a way that made my heart flutter. I stopped myself, shook my head, and chuckled, telling myself I was being silly. Midnight was a horse, a beautiful horse, but still just a horse. I tried to dismiss the thought. Unusual ideas started entering my head, and as time passed, I visited the barn, increasingly often, staying longer each time. I felt a growing fondness for Midnight, the horse, which I couldn't understand. I felt bad because I was so connected to an animal while having a husband. However, the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger my feelings grew. Midnight was always present, but my husband, Richard, wasn't really there for me. I wasn't unfaithful in the typical way. There was no physical cheating, no traditional affair. But on an emotional level, I had done something wrong. I began sharing my feelings with Midnight, something I should have only done with my husband. Then, one night, everything fell apart. Richard came home earlier than expected from a trip. I didn't hear his car arrive because I was, as always, in the barn with Midnight. I hadn't realized how long I'd been there. Lost in my peculiar emotional bond with the horse, when Richard walked in. In the horse barn, Richard discovered me near midnight. The horse, around midnight. I was quietly talking to the animal and didn't see Richard enter until he spoke. His tone was harsh, full of bewilderment and distrust. He looked back and forth between Midnight and me, as if puzzled by what he was observing. I became motionless, my heart racing. I was at a loss for words, unsure how to justify my actions without appearing crazy. Richard watched me, anticipating an answer I couldn't provide. I was clueless about how to describe the emotional turmoil I had been experiencing. The quiet in the barn seemed endless, interrupted only by Midnight's soft breathing. The horse was oblivious to the tension that had suddenly emerged. "Jessica, what is happening?" Richard asked again, his voice a blend of bewilderment and frustration. He moved closer, his eyes squinting as he attempted to comprehend the situation. I instinctively retreated, placing a hand on Midnight's flank, as if the horse could protect me from the impending argument. "It's not what it looks like, Richard," I stuttered, unsure what he even thought was happening. How could I describe what he saw when I barely grasped it myself? Richard shook his head, unconvinced. "Then tell me," he said, "because I arrived home early and found you here, murmuring to our horse like I don't even know. What am I supposed to think?" I inhaled deeply, struggling to explain the deep bond I had formed with Midnight without seeming completely irrational. "Insane, Richard. You've been gone a lot lately," I started, and I could already see the frustration building in his eyes. "I know it's your job, and I know you're working hard for us, but I've been lonely, and Midnight, he's been here for me. He's listened when I didn't have anyone else." He threw his hands up. In exasperation, "He's a horse. Jessica, you're talking like he's a person." I winced at his words, but I couldn't deny that he was right. "I know," I whispered, "but he was there when you weren't." I started to talk to him because I didn't have anyone else. It got out of hand. Richard looked at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and hurt. "So what you're saying, you had an emotional affair with a horse?" The word sounded absurd even to me, but the reality of the situation wasn't as far fetched as it seemed. I didn't mean for it to happen, I said quietly, tears welling up in my eyes. "I was just so lonely, Richard. I needed someone to talk to, and Midnight was there." He shook his head again, clearly struggling to process everything. "So what are you telling me? That you love him? That you'd rather be with him than me?" His voice cracked slightly, and I could tell that beneath the anger there was a deep sense of betrayal. "No, of course not," I replied quickly, stepping forward and reaching for his hand. "I love you, Richard, but I was lonely, and I made a mistake. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I turned to Midnight when I should have turned to you." He pulled his hand away, pacing back and forth in the small stable. "This is insane. I don't even know how to wrap my head around this. I come home, and this is what I find my wife confessing some kind of emotional affair with our horse. I stood there helplessly, unsure of how to fix the situation. "Richard, please. It wasn't like that. I didn't do anything physical, nothing inappropriate. I got lost in the loneliness for a moment." He didn't say anything. He just stood there, his back turned to me as he tried to collect his thoughts. Then, finally, he spoke. "Do you know how crazy this sounds, Jessica? How ridiculous this whole situation is?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but it's the truth. I let my loneliness cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry. I never meant for it to get this far." Richard turned to face me, his expression softening slightly. "Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way?" I tried, I said, my voice trembling. But every time I brought it up, you were too busy, or too tired, or just distracted. And eventually, I gave up. I thought maybe this was just how things were going to be, so I found comfort in midnight, and I know that sound ridiculous. But he was there for me, in a way you weren't. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know you felt this way. I thought we were fine." "We weren't," I replied softly, but I didn't want to burden you with it. You were always so busy with work, and I didn't want to seem needy, but the truth is, I needed you, Richard. I needed my husband. And when you weren't there, I turned to midnight. There was a long silence between us as we both stood there, the weight of the situation sinking in. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice much softer this time. "I don't know what to do with this, Jessica. I don't know how to move forward from here." I took a deep breath, feeling the tears spill over onto my cheeks. "I don't either," I admitted, "but I want to fix this. I want to fix us. 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 I love you, and I don't want to lose you." Richard, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. "I love you too, Jessica, but this is gonna take time." I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." He sighed again, finally stepping closer to me. "We need to talk about this, really talk about everything, not just midnight, but us, where we went wrong and how we can fix it." I nodded, reaching out to take his hand again, this time feeling him squeeze it back. "I'm ready to talk, Richard. I'm ready to talk, Richard. I'm ready to talk. Make things right." As we stood there in the stable, the air thick with the weight of our conversation, I realized that this was the first step in rebuilding what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could find our way back to each other. And with that, Jessica and Richard begin the long process of healing their marriage, learning to reconnect and rediscovering the love that had once brought them together.